I'm Malcolm McGregor of McGregor, the 24th Chief of Clan Gregor. It is an honour for me to be able to give a message on this video to McGregors worldwide. We are a great clan and we have a great history and we have much to be proud of. And we have two organisations where we have the opportunity to enjoy that history: the Clan Gregor Society of Scotland and the American Clan Gregor Society. Additionally, I have the great privilege of attending many events in Scotland, such as Highland Games at Glen and other places in Scotland, and I hope very much that I have the opportunity to meet you all at some point in the future.
This is the land of Dalriada, the origin of Scottish kings. It was part of a great dominion in the 6th century, a place haunted by the memory of great battles, bloodshed, painted warriors fighting against the invader. This was the land of the Dark Ages, governed by great lords and tribal chiefs. Loch Awe in Argyll is one of the earliest parts of Scotland to be inhabited by people who came from Europe and followed the rivers and lochs to settle close to these shores as early as 4,000 years BC. There were two races occupying what is today Scotland: the Picts and the Britons. Now, very little is known about these early inhabitants apart from their brief descriptions by Roman writers. These Celtic people had successfully resisted the Roman legions, and what the Romans called Caledonia was never incorporated into the empire. As the Romans withdrew from Britain, these northern islanders were faced with new invaders. These were the Scots from Ireland and the Angles from Germany. It's with the Scots that we are concerned, for it's they who finally succeeded in conquering Scotland, uniting its peoples and giving them their line of kings. From these Scots, we will trace the ancestry of what was to become the Clan McGregor. Dalriada was a Scots-Irish kingdom in the first millennium, stretching along the west coast of Scotland and the northeastern corner of Northern Ireland. In time, the Dalriadan kingdom of Scotland overshadowed that in Ireland, and the kings made their home here in Argyll, in its ancient capital of Dunad. In AD 843, the Dalriadic king Kenneth MacAlpine was crowned King of Alba. The Clan McGregor claims descent from Gregor, third son of King Alpine, but there is no historical evidence for this. They were neighbours of the MacNabs, and their motto, "My race is royal," contains the claim that they shared the same royal origins. The McGregors were the first named people to have lived in the area of Glen. Even before Christian times, the site of Dalmally Church, in those days in Ireland, was the worshipping place for Neolithic man. St Columba landed in Iona in 563, and from that time onwards, missionaries from great monastic houses in Ireland found their way to Argyll.
The date of the first Christian settlement is unknown, but these ancient people who believed that evil spirits couldn't cross running water probably built a church on the island. And the legend that 3 of the early Scottish kings are buried close to the site of the present church does suggest an earlier foundation.
This church is first mentioned in written records as a burial place of the Clan Gregor in the 14th century.
In 1988, restoration work started on the church, which was to reveal a grisly find. The floorboards were taken up to reveal dwarf walls that ran in a north-south direction across the entire church. These were removed by the building contractors, and as they were digging holes for support structures for the gallery, they came across human bones.
The local Oban police force were called in to investigate the finds and soon reached the conclusion that they were not dealing with a burial, but with the random scatter of human remains.
It appears that these were human remains disturbed when the surrounding earth had been gathered up to form a level base for the building of the present church in 1809. And in that earth were these bones, which had been buried at a much earlier period, probably the 14th century.
It would seem that the high altar at which the leaders of Clan Gregor were buried must have lain under the present tower. Legend states that the site of the church and its immediate neighbourhood was the burial ground of those of the Clan McGregor killed in a 16th or early 17th century battle with the Campbells. In this churchyard are several gravestones of great antiquity with figures of a warrior, each furnished with a spear and a claymore. One, said to be part of the coffin of a McGregor, is a fine running pattern of foliage and flowers. There are also many stones of later date which bear such emblems as the skulls or bones.
The church is dedicated to St. Conan, who is an uncle of St. Fillan, and the fact that the chief of Clan McGregor called his son Gilafowlin devotee of St. Fillan suggests that he was part of a band of followers.
This is the land of Glenorchy, and it's reputed that Clan Gregor were located here as early as the reign of Malcolm Can Mór in 1057 till 1093. John, Lord of Glenorchy, grandson of Gregor and therefore great-grandson of King Alpine, is said to have married a beautiful English woman who came as a refugee to Scotland in the train of Queen Margaret, wife of King Malcolm III.
Their eldest son, Malcolm of the Castles, was so called because, according to tradition, he built the now vanished castle of Glen near Castle's farmhouse that stands at the foot of the waterfall on Ben Eunuch, known as the Grey Mare's Tail, and also the first castle of Kilhurn.
Malcolm was a man of immense strength. He saved the life of a Scottish king, either David I or Malcolm IV, by pulling up an oak tree, roots and all, to drive off a wild boar. Hence the oak eradicate, or oak with roots, became the arms of Chief of Clan Gregor. Cadet branches of the clan have a Scots pine in place of the oak tree.
The king who Malcolm rescued, in gratitude, made him a baron with full powers of justiciary over the lands of Glen and Glenorchy, and Malcolm's brother Gregor became abbot of Dunkeld, and churchmen, being allowed to marry in those days, started the clan MacNab, son of the abbot.
In Glenorchy, the Fletchers, the first to light a fire to boil water in the Glen, were arrow makers of the McGregors. The name Fletcher, Mac and Leicester, means son of the arrow. They remained in Glenorchy until the early 1600s.
Sir Duncan Campbell of Glenorchy, Black Duncan of the Cowl, by subterfuge drove them out. But that is another story.
Glenorchy was therefore chosen as their homeland. Hugh of Glenorchy may have been the first of their chiefs, but historians are fairly certain that the first chief of the clan Gregor was Gregor of the Golden Bridles, with his son Ian Cam, One Eye, succeeding as the second chief of the clan. Now the word clan derives from the Gaelic language, meaning children. It was first used many centuries ago. The chief of the clan held land on behalf of his kinsmen and women, like trustees, and they believed they had a blood relationship with the founder of the clan. The ordinary clansmen and women had great pride in race, and their relationship with the chief was like that of adult children to a father, showing loyalty and dignity towards him. The concept of clanship is very old, and a more feudal system of authority gradually crept in. In these early feudal centuries, the clan Gregor possessed a wide stretch of territory across the middle of the Highlands, from Ben Cruachan to the neighbourhood of Fortingal in Glen Lyon, and as far south as the pass of Balmaha on Loch Lomond side, and the chain of lochs which run eastwards to Menteith, not far from Callander. In the reign of James II of Scotland, Duncan, Lord Campbell, the King's Lieutenant of Argyll, was granted the superiority or hereditary right of authority over both Glenorchy and Glenstrae. Significantly, he gave Glenorchy to Colin, the eldest son of his second marriage, while retaining Glenstrae.
This meant that the McGregors of Glenstrae, as vassals, were forced to submit to their jurisdiction, but they could also claim the protection of the senior house of Campbell, the Earls of Argyll, against the increasing aggrandisement of the Campbells of Glenorchy.
Nevertheless, the McGregors maintained for a long time that the actual possession of the land was by the hand of God, and they knew no other right than that of the sword, but ultimately that was found unavailing, and at last, expelled from their own territory, they were to become an outlawed, lawless and landless clan.
The beginning of the downfall of Clan MacGregor can be traced back to the time when the Crown of Scotland was in dispute between the Balials and the Bruces. Now, Bruce had shown little inclination to aid the efforts of Scotland's greatest patriot, William Wallace. So let's not blame the MacGregors for not rushing to help Bruce.
The MacGregors were neighbours of the MacNabs and were related through the male line. The MacNabs succeeded in attracting some of the MacGregor clansmen to the Balliol cause, but Malcolm, the chief of Clan Gregor, a person of great loyalty, was strongly attached to Bruce, whom he had rescued from Alexander MacDougall, Lord of Lorne, at a battle near Dalry, just south of Tyndrum, in 1306. Alexander opposed Bruce because he had murdered his nephew, Red Comyn, in the sanctity of the Greyfriars Church in Dumfries.
Now, Malcolm, chief of Clan Gregor, is reputed to have charged into the fray to support Bruce, riding a milk-white horse. and thereafter the king harboured in a large cave on McGregor lands near Craig Croston on the east side of Loch Lomond, which to this day is still called the King's Cave, and from where the king crossed the loch to meet with the Earl of Lennox. Later, Malcolm fought under Edward Bruce in Ireland and was wounded at the Battle of Dundalk, always known thereafter as the Lame Lord.
After Bannockburn, the McGregors were put in a very weak position when Bruce decided to thank his supporters by offering them tracts of land as a reward for their loyalty.
Their other neighbours, the Campbells, had, however, pinned their colours firmly to the mast of Robert the Bruce and were consequently in great favour within the king's circles.
As a royal gift, Robert the Bruce handed over the barony of Loch Awe, which included much of the McGregor lands, to the chief of the Campbells.
Unfortunately, the rights of tenancy were rather spurious in those days, and it was of no consequence to them if the land in question was already occupied by another clan who may raise their swords in defence of their territory.
It was then left to the recipient of the king's largesse to decide just how he would take ownership of his new territory.
John McGregor of Glenorchy, grandson of Malcolm, who had died in 1390, is said to have had 3 sons. Patrick, his successor, John Dow, ancestor of the family of Glenstray, who became clan chief, and Gregor, ancestor of the McGregors of Roro.
Patrick's son Malcolm was compelled by the Campbells to sell the land of Auchenreivach in Strathfillan to Campbell of Glenorchy, who thus obtained the first footing in Breadalbin, which afterwards gave the title of Earl to his family.
Sir Colin Campbell, the first Campbell laird of Glenorchy, built Kilhern Castle in 1440 on what was believed to be the site of the original McGregor Castle of the 11th century. Sir Colin wanted to increase his land holdings, so he contrived a feud between the McGregors and their kinsmen, the McNabs.
This resulted in him gaining some land from both clans, but failed in his efforts to drive the McGregors from Glenstray. Patrick McGregor, the 5th chief of Glenstray, died there in 1461 in his fortalice of Stranmelchen, just east of the River Stray. His son, Ian Dhu, the white-toothed falcon of the glens, was described by a bard as the king of cattle lifting, the boldest chief in any land, giving his horses and his gold just as freely as a king should give. The McGregors were great cattle lifters, but so were all their neighbours at that time. The rustling of cattle, then the main form of currency in the Highlands, was common practice, although a source of many a feud. Ian Dhu McGregor died in 1519. On the day of his burial, in a stone coffin within the walls of the old church at Dysart, a great meteor was seen in Glenorchy. People foretold disaster, claiming it had come when Ian Dhu's son was disinherited by his overlord, the 3rd Earl of Argyll. The man chosen to replace the son of Ian Dhu was his cousin, John McGregor, descendant of John, founder of McGregors of Glengyle and Roro. John, who became the 7th chief of Glenstray, ravished and subsequently married Helen, the youngest daughter of Sir Colin Campbell, 6th of Glenorchy, who was known as Grey Colin. A lease of 1550 was granted by Grey Colin to "my beloved servant, John McGregor. By its terms, John received the tax or tenancy of 3 farms, all in Glenorchy, as well as the grazing on the land around Kilhurn Castle. In addition, he had the use of the mill at Kincracken, for all of which he paid the rent in the form of 68 balls of meal.
This arrangement worked well for several years, but unfortunately John died young, and his son who succeeded him, Alistair, was a minor. Now Duncan Ladisach, Duncan the Lordly, became his tutor, and thus, until he came of age, held nominal authority over the clan. Now the influence of Duncan Ladisach, who loathed the Campbells, proved fatal to young Alistair.
When the young chief came of age, Duncan persuaded him to raid the country of the Robertsons in Perthshire, where they burnt the chief's house to the ground. The McGregors then continued to feud with their neighbours in what appears in retrospect to have been in defiance of all common sense. For now, of all times, they needed to behave with great circumspection, for Grey Colin Campbell of Glenorchy was intriguing to buy the superiority, that is, the right of jurisdiction of Glenstray, from the 6th Earl of Argyll.
Grey Colin was successful. The McGregors had lost the protection of the senior house of Campbell. Now all Grey Colin wanted was to be rid of them off his land.
This became apparent when Alistair's son, called Gregor Roy because of his red hair, came of age. Grey Colin refused to enfeoff him, and Gregor Roy, landless and driven from his home, could only exist by stealing cattle. This is Glen Lyon, and it was here that the unfortunate Gregor Roy, chief of the McGregors of Glenstray, was hunted by Grey Colin in 1570. According to the Glen Lyon tradition, Duncan Campbell of Glen Lyon, who lived at Carban, about 2 miles above the pass, had a daughter whom he intended giving in marriage to the Baron of Dal on the south side of Loch Tay.
Now the daughter of the house was of a different opinion, for having met young Gregor McGregor of Glenstray, she gave up to him her heart's warmest affection, which he fully returned, and despite all opposition, she left her father's house and married him.
In consequence, Gregor and his wife were followed with the most unrelenting enmity. Gregor's young wife returned to the shelter of her father's house, perhaps to give birth to a son. But this didn't deter Gregor, for he visited her secretly at night. He was soon betrayed and running for his life. He jumped the River Lion here, at a place still called McGregor's Leap. They were often obliged to wander from place to place, taking shelter in caves, under rocks, and in thickets of woods. On the night preceding the 5th of April, 1570, they had rested under a rock on a hillside above Loch Tay. Next morning, after taking such breakfast as in the circumstances they could compass, the young wife cuddled her young babe in her arms, whilst Gregor was fondly playing with it. In an instant, they were surrounded by a band of their foes, and they were carried off to Balach.
McGregor was immediately condemned to death and beheaded at Kenmore in the presence of Sir Colin, and the traditional tale ends thus. Most pitiful of all, the unutterably wretched wife was forced to witness her husband's execution. Some accounts say that Sir Colin actually wielded the axe himself, watched by various neighbours that included the Earl of Athol, the Lord Justice Clerk, and Gregor's father-in-law, Duncan Campbell of Glen.
These were fearsome times, and not the best time in the world to carry the name McGregor. But the spark of defiance that had always been part of the McGregor character glowed brighter and brighter. The clan became a fighting force once more, sallying forth into the neighbouring territories, wreaking revenge upon those who had taken part in their downfall and becoming even more prolific cattle thieves in the process. In short, the Clan Gregor became a menace to all their neighbours, and the neighbours were, not unnaturally, very fed up with them. This culminated in Sir John Campbell of Glenorchy, along with several other barons, petitioning Queen Mary to put an end to these wild people for once and for all. The Queen agreed to this request, and consequently Campbell was given leave to pursue the McGregors with fire and sword, and so the pursuit of the McGregors commenced once again. Queen Mary was to later regret her decision, for on hearing of the plight of the McGregors, she wrote to the Laird of Weem asking him to give them sanctuary in his land, as she realised they could not survive without shelter and possessions. The chief of Clan Campbell, Grey Colin Campbell of Glenorchy, was totally ruthless in his determination to take possession of the lands bestowed upon him by Bruce, and sent his armies in to evict any McGregor who dared stay in what had been their traditional homelands. The Campbells poured in by the hundreds, ruthless in the pursuit of the McGregors. This was to be ethnic cleansing at its very worst. The outlaws were resilient. They knew the countryside and knew where they could hide in relative safety. The McGregor clan earned the title Children of the Mist in their days of lawlessness, when they were the most adept of all the clans in vanishing from the scene when it suited them. But they were now a homeless people, hunted down by their neighbours at any opportunity. The McGregors may have been fighting for the lands they had occupied for centuries, but the Campbells had the benefit of a court order authorising the evictions, so every act of resistance on the part of the McGregors was classified as a criminal offence, meaning that they became a legitimate target for anyone who wished to take part in this shameful episode. By now, their numbers had been sadly depleted, and they were in a fairly hopeless situation. We have no idea how many McGregors were slain in this dreadful period in their history, but as their houses were burnt and their cattle stolen or massacred, the McGregors were forced to retreat until all that was left was a small area of land in Glenstray. Rustling and poaching were their only means of sustaining their families, for by now their own cattle had been slaughtered or stolen by the Campbells, and their options were limited in the extreme.
So this was a case of steal food or starving to death. Here we've got a classic situation of one man's freedom fighter being another man's villain. It was the story of the McGregors, not just another example of man's inhumanity to man.
But still the clan survived. However, an event was about to take place that would have a devastating effect upon the remains of the McGregor clan.
I'm standing on the spot where Almost 400 years ago, the Battle of Glen Fruin was fought. Now, it was a battle that had long-reaching consequences for Clan Gregor.
Looming over the Clan McGregor like a black shadow was the dark presence of Gillespie Grumach, Archibald the Grim, Earl of Argyll. He had been awarded full powers of lieutenancy over the McGregors and was keen to ensure that the clan continued in their downward spiral, as it was his intention to take possession of their lands at the earliest opportunity. Not only McGregor land, but also the land belonging to their neighbours, the McNabs.
In the year 1602, a small incident took place that was to shape the destiny of the McGregors for many years to come.
Two McGregors were travelling from Glasgow to their home at Dunan, and as night fell, they found themselves on the banks of Loch Lomond in territory owned by the Cahoon clan. Highland hospitality would normally have been offered to the passing strangers, who were no more than boys, but on this occasion it was refused. The pair took shelter in an empty hut and killed a sheep belonging to the Cahoons, which they prepared for a meal. However, they were discovered the following morning, and in spite of their offers to pay for the sheep, Sir Humphrey Cahoon had them seized and sentenced them to be hanged. In spite of the intervention of MacGregor of Glengyle, and in spite of the rope breaking at the first attempt, an occurrence that would normally have satisfied them all, the two boys were hanged. Their heads were then severed and put on stakes, which were placed by the gates of Rossdew House.
By now, what had started as a breach of manners had built up into something major. Glengyle reported these happenings to the clan chief, Alistair MacGregor of Glenstray, who conformed with the king's instructions and took the matter to the Earl of Argyll, who counselled that Cahoon should pay compensation to the boy's mother, and a meeting was arranged between the two parties. This was fully within Scots legal practice of the time, and by way of security, each party would bring 100 armed men. But smelling treachery, MacGregor doubled his force,
concealing half of them at a point some distance from the meeting point.
His foresight proved correct, for at the instigation of Argyll, Cahoon had mustered an army of 700 men and placed them in positions to ambush the MacGregors.
The leaders met and discussed the problems, MacGregor stating that there would be no bloodshed this time. He then led his men away, but taking a route away from where the Cahoons lay in ambush, eventually crossing the stream that bordered the two territories. The frustrated Sir Humphrey called his men from their concealed positions and started to pursue the MacGregors. But years of combating adversity had sharpened the martial skills of the MacGregors. The pursuers were caught in a gully near a stream full of deep holes and were at the mercy of the MacGregors, who inflicted massive casualties upon them. The MacGregor bowmen then rained arrows upon the tightly packed Cahoon army. Some accounts report 80 dead, others 140, but the slaughter of their comrades was enough to send the remainder of the Cahoon army into a panic-stricken retreat. Only one MacGregor of note was listed as having been killed in the action. He was the brother of the chief, and the spot where he fell is marked by a stone known as the Grey Stone of Glen.
The McGregors completed the rout of the Gahoons by driving off a huge amount of their livestock. Some reports say 300 cattle, 100 horses, 400 sheep and 400 goats were taken. A heavy price to pay for the loss of a single sheep.
Now the McGregors may have won the battle, but it was destined to become a Pyrrhic victory.
The Gahoons wanted revenge, and a large delegation set out for Stirling to petition King James, but this was no ordinary demand upon the king. A large procession of the widows of the battle arrived in Stirling, and their appearance must have been very dramatic. They rode slowly through the streets of the town,
and each of them carrying a spear upon which the blood-stained shirt of their dead husband was carried.
It was a very well staged managed affair, and it's very unlikely that the women were actually widows, but the shirts, or bloody sacks, had been dipped in sheep's blood to give maximum effect.
King James was indeed moved by this display of sorrow and made a declaration that would have far-reaching consequences for anyone born with the name McGregor.
The name McGregor was to be abolished altogether, and henceforth no man would be allowed to use the name, and no man would stand and defend the right to use the name. Those who chose to ignore this edict were executed on the spot, and their wives and children were stripped, branded, whipped and raped before being sent off to Britain's new colony in North America, where they were sold as slaves. All of this in the name of justice.
Those who had taken part in any armed incursion were forbidden to carry any weapon. Only a blunt knife was allowed for the purposes of eating. Execution was immediate for any McGregors found in a group of more than 4, and if a McGregor wanted to survive, he had no alternative but to adopt the name of a neighbouring clan.
This persecution of Clan McGregor must surely be considered to be one of the most shameful episodes in Scottish history, and certainly the only instance where a name was considered sufficient for its bearer to be persecuted.
Their main protagonists were now the Earls of Argyll and Atholl, eagerly assisted by the Marquess of Huntly. They pursued the McGregors with great zeal and enthusiasm until the clan chief, Alistair McGregor of Glen, realised they were now facing total genocide. Alistair believed that he could rely on Campbell of Archaeology, who was his first cousin once removed. Alistair's grandmother had been a Campbell of Archaeology.
Alistair called him the man I did maist trust unto, and he accordingly went to Archaeology on the south side of the head of Loch Fyne, but Archaeology had armed men waiting, and they took him.
They put Alistair in a boat with his hands tied and set off over the sea down Loch Fyne to deliver him to Argyll at Inverary. He was a strong man and he was desperate. Somehow he got his hands loose, struck down the fellow beside him and leapt overboard. Swimming and diving, he reached the shore, and in an hour was safe again amongst the kindly hills. Alistair decided that in order to save the clan from extinction, he would have no option but to surrender himself to the Earl of Argyll, who by now had succeeded in his ambition to take possession of the McGregor lands. His surrender was made on the basis that he would be allowed to leave Scotland, and this was duly agreed by his captors. And indeed, he was allowed to leave the country. He was escorted as far as Berwick-on-Tweed, just over the border. But in an act of treachery by Argyll, he was promptly rearrested and brought back to Edinburgh as a prisoner in chains and thrown into one of the dungeons which lie deep under the mighty fortress of Edinburgh Castle. Alistair McGregor was brought to trial in Edinburgh on the 20th of January 1604 and was sentenced to death by hanging. He was brought to the spot now marked by the heart of Midlothian, where, along with several of his followers, was publicly executed before a jeering crowd. The only concession to his superior rank was that his scaffold was his own height higher than those of his followers.
His head was sent to Dumbarton and placed above the toll booth. The memories of Glen Fruin had been avenged.
Sir Walter Scott wrote of this: "Through the depths of Loch Katrine the steed shall career, o'er the peak of Glenlomond the galley shall steer, and the rocks of Craigroston like icicles melt, ere our wrongs be forgot, or our vengeance unfelt. If they rob us of name and pursue us with beagles, give their roofs to the flame and their flesh to the eagles."
By now, it would seem that the name McGregor was indeed erased forever. But their unity as a clan remained unbroken in spite of all the oppressive proceedings that were directed against them.
These did not cease with the reign of James VI, for under Charles I all the enactments against them were renewed. Yet in 1644, when the Marquess of Montrose set up the King's Standard in the Highlands, the clan Gregor, to the number of 1,000 fighting men, joined him, under the command of Patrick McGregor of Glenstray, their chief. In reward for their loyalty, at the Restoration the various statutes against them were annulled, when the clansmen were enabled to resume their own name. In the reign of William III, however, the penal enactments against them were renewed in their full force.
The clan was again proscribed and compelled once more to take other names, but still the persecution of the remaining McGregors continued. Clan members were forbidden to take part in baptism, in Holy Communion and marriage, and were hunted for sport.
Producing the severed head of a McGregor was sufficient to allow a pardon for criminals who had previously been sought for thievery and murder.
The direct male line of chiefs now became extinct, and representation passed by formal renunciation of chiefship to the branch of Glengyle. Now, of this branch is the celebrated Rob Roy, that is, Red Rob, who assumed the name Campbell under the Prescriptive Act. Rob Roy was born about 1660. He was the younger son of Donald McGregor of Glengyle, a lieutenant colonel in the service of King James VII. His wife was the daughter of Archibald Campbell of Glenlyon, her grandfather on her mother's side being Sir Robert Campbell of Glenorchy. Rob Roy himself married Helen Mary, daughter of MacGregor of Cromer.
His own designation was that of Inversnaid, but he seems to have acquired a right to the property of Craigroston, a domain of rock and forest lying on the east side of Loch Lomond. He became tutor to his nephew, the head of the Glengyle branch, then in his minority, who claimed the chiefship of the clan. Rob Roy McGregor's story has been muddied over the years, seen by Sir Walter Scott as a Scottish Robin Hood, but by others as a rogue and a thief, described as being polite and courteous, or alternatively, arrogant and bullying. By the time of the 1715 rebellion, Rob Roy McGregor had become famous throughout Scotland, and he joined the Jacobites in their struggle against the forces of the Crown. He does not appear to have emerged from the struggle with honour. At the Battle of Sheriff Muir, he refused to lead his men in a charge that might well have altered the course of the battle, preferring instead to plunder from the bodies of those who had fallen in battle, an action that prompted the following ballad. Rob Roy he stood watch on a hill for to catch the booty for aught that I saw man, for he ne'er advanced from the place where he standst till nae mair was to do there at all man.
In defence of Rob Roy, it must be said that this is disputed and that he had actually been given orders to defend the ford at the River Allen to allow some of the Jacobites to withdraw.
Rob Roy was not to see the next Jacobite rebellion, but his 3 sons were to fight for bonnie Prince Charlie in the Rising of 1745. They were at the forefront of the Highland onslaught at the Battle of Preston Pans. Fortunately for the trio, they were not at Culloden, but one of them, James, was attainted for high treason. However, not being one of the ringleaders, he was pardoned and allowed to go in peace.
The Rising in 1745 had disastrous consequences all over Scotland, and in Glen, many of the clans, including the McGregors, the MacLarens and the Stuarts, who had supported the forces of bonnie Prince Charlie, had their lands forfeited and their homes burnt.
The McGregor estate at Invercraig was laid waste, and you can still see the remains of their burial ground at the top of Lochdoin.
In spite of living a life of violence, Rob Roy died in his bed a sick old man, and he's reputed to have expressed sorrow for his wayward life, an action that made his wife laugh and tell him to die like a man.
According to legend, he retorted with the following words: "You have put strife between me and the best men of the country, and now you would place enmity between me and my God." This simple gravestone marks the final resting place of Rob Roy McGregor, arguably the most famous McGregor of all times.
Well, was he a villain or was he a hero? I think he was a little bit of both. The McGregors were no different to the other Scottish clans who travelled round the world and could be found in every part of the globe.
Fortunately for the reputation of the Clan Gregor, many others of the clan made their way to various points of the globe where they were highly successful in politics, movies, industry and medicine. It's a sad fact, but it's highly probable that there are now thousands of people around the world who will never know that they are truly McGregors. The annual gathering of the Clan Gregor is a very friendly and relaxed affair, and having seen and heard of the trials and tribulations of the clan over the centuries, I'm sure you'll agree that it's amazing how many make the journey to attend it. Old James VI would be burling in his grave if he could see the hundreds of well-dressed, happy, smiling people who congregate together, anything but altogether abolished as he commanded. They travel from all over the world just to celebrate the glory of the name McGregor, and they absolutely revel in the company of their fellow clansmen.
And why shouldn't they? We've already seen some of the history of this clan and how their forefathers survived in the face of almost constant adversity. And adversity was never very far away if your name happened to be McGregor. Don't Mr. me, nor Campbell me. My foot is on my native heath, and my name is McGregor. These words, put into the mouth of Rob Roy by Sir Walter Scott, express in a nutshell much of the spirit and the story of this extraordinary clan.
Strangely enough, no tribe in the Highlands was more proud of its ancient name than the McGregors, and no tribe had to suffer more for bearing that name, or was more cruelly compelled to abandon it.
My race is royal, was and is the proud boast of the McGregors, and no more bitter fate could be imposed upon them than to give up the evidence of that descent. The inscription on Rob's grave sums it up for me. McGregor, despite them.